296-2967 if they experience a technical difficulty during the meeting. You may obtain a copy of the notice and agenda at the website or by sending an email to carol.moreland@ks.gov with the subject line, request for the agenda, and the board staff shall send it to you. The only mediums for interactive communication offered for this meeting are the connections by Zoom and YouTube as previously stated. Each member of the board, board staff, or presenter shall state the person's name and title each time the person speaks or votes, as the case may be. Each participant to this meeting shall ensure microphones, phones, or other electronic devices are on mute when the participant is not speaking. Each motion will be clearly stated before the board votes, and the president will announce the results of the final vote. A statement or motion will clearly identify and authorize by delegation each member of the board or staff who will be permitted to sign any document on behalf of the board. The meeting is being recorded and the recording will be posted to the board's website. The board has the following items listed on the agenda: call to order, discuss possible changes to licensure requirement, and then adjournment. As noted above, the board may take an executive session. If the board elects to exercise the option to go into executive session, the board will follow this process. First, the board must be in an open session before going into executive session. Then a motion will be made and seconded. Pursuant to KSA 75-4319B, the motion must contain the statement of justification for closure, the subjects to be discussed, and the time and place that the open meeting will resume. If a motion for executive session passes, public will be excused from that portion of the meeting as the executive session will be conducted by electronic means that will not be made available to the public. The board members will return to the open meeting after the executive session. The open meeting will resume when the board members return to the Zoom and YouTube meeting after the executive session. The complete motion for an executive session will be recorded in the minutes. The meeting is now called to order and the board will begin the meeting with the next item on the agenda. So I think, and as a reminder, this is a task force meeting, so we really won't be making any motions or approving anything today. This is really just information gathering and some learning and time for us to have some discussions among the board. So moving to our first item, I believe we have a presentation by Kansas Hospital Association.
Yeah, Madam President, this is Carol Moreland, Administrator, and we actually have two representatives, Karen Brayman and Jaron Caffrey, who want to come and just kind of share some information with you about healthcare apprenticeships. And they do have information that's in your packet. It would start on page 3. And Colton, can we bring up their slides? I think you wanted us to do that, right, Jaron?
Either way, yes, if you have them, if you want to, and I can just say next slide as we go through, whatever works best for the group.
Okay, I did put them in their packet, so
okay.
To let you know, I put all that information in there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Well, Carol, if it's okay with you and Madam President, while Colton's pulling up Jaron's slides, I just wanted to thank you all for the invitation to attend your meeting today and share some information that Jaron Caffrey on our team here at the Hospital Association has been researching around apprenticeships. I'm Karen Brayman. I'm Senior Vice President for Clinical and Strategic Initiatives with the Hospital Association. I've been here about 5.5 years. And about a year ago, our board asked the KHA team to work in a concerted effort on workforce challenges. I'm sure, as you all are well aware, workforce is a challenge really across the state and certainly in our hospitals across the state. Jaron Caffrey is in a new role as our project manager for workforce strategies. We were fortunate in that he had spent a year at KHA as our data intern. He's now also working on his master's in health service administration from the University of Kansas Kansas and transitioned into that workforce strategies role. I have had the pleasure of working with Carol since I kind of assumed my role and some expanded responsibilities about 3 years or so, and really appreciate the partnership and the collaboration and dialogue with Carol and team and you all. And actually, years ago, I had the pleasure of working with Adrian when we were both at the state. So we appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all today. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jaron. Jaron has done some research that we wanted to share with you all as the nursing experts in Kansas. So with that, Jaron.
Well, thank you, Karen. Can everyone hear me okay? Just want to make sure before okay, thank you. And hopefully you're seeing the full screen of the slides instead of the notes. So if that changes at any time, just let me know and I'll adjust it. But it's great to be here with you all this afternoon. Thank you, Karen, for the introduction. Thanks, Carol and this group for having us. Carol and I also have the pleasure to serve on a Board of Regents work group together. So it's great to be here with all of you today and to see you, Carol. So thanks for having us. So, just kind of diving into it a little bit. Just, a few things, housekeeping things, I guess. Please interrupt me at any time or use the chat. I certainly want this to be, we are sharing information, obviously, but I do want it to be interactive if it should be. And so if there is a question on anything that you have, when you see it on a slide, feel free to unmute, interrupt me, put it in the chat. I'll try and check that, whatever works for you, because certainly want to help. And we'll have some time at the end, I think, to have maybe a few questions to dive into this a little bit deeper. So just kind of setting the stage, as I'm sure you're all very aware, I don't think many of us need to have any kind of a lecture about this. We're having some workforce issues, right? And so as Karen mentioned, me in this new role as managing workforce strategies at the Hospital Association, we do a lot of data keeping around some of these items. And so just wanted to share a few various points that might be of relevance to this committee as it kind of sets the stage for this conversation and for this idea of healthcare apprenticeship and maybe how that can maybe impact our workforce situation when it comes to healthcare in Kansas. So just starting off here with these slides, it says nursing vacancy rates and nursing turnover rates. I will share there is CNA, LPN, and RN. And so obviously we're aware, CNAs are not members of, or they're not nurses, right? But just incorporating this as really that nursing team, CNAs are often, part of this foundational team in healthcare. So that's why you see that under there. So don't be misled by the nursing, the label on that when it comes to the CNAs. But anyways, you'll see obviously throughout time, the pandemic hit 2020, 2021, and that really made a large jump in what we were experiencing with both nursing vacancy rates and turnover rates. And really, it's not just limited to nursing, right? It is throughout many healthcare roles. But there is obviously that focus on nursing, since that is the foundational, key component there, that cornerstone of hospitals, of long-term care, really throughout the healthcare system. And so you'll see there a clear spike on this top chart, nursing vacancy rates from 2020 to 2021, very pronounced throughout, RNs, LPNs, and CNAs. That clear jump there, as you can see, to 20 to 22% there for LPNs. And we did experience that with turnover rates as well. And again, you'll see there, the dark blue is for CNAs. CNAs always have, fairly high turnover, right? These are positions that maybe they're more entry level. So maybe CNAs are then getting their LPN. So they're turning over in that regard. Or maybe it's a high school student serving as a CNA and they're leaving the profession. So that's always had traditionally high turnover rates. We did still see an increase there through the pandemic, but we also saw increases from the LPNs and staff nurses, those RNs, turnover rates from our hospitals. So COVID certainly exacerbated this issue. Of course, as we're all aware, there was a workforce issue even before the pandemic, but the pandemic really was that driver that made things different and made things even more dire, and is really why we are really feeling those pains today. And so you'll see here these same three positions of LPNs, RNs, and CNAs. We have the vacancies and turnover rates split out urban and rural. Again, we collect this information statewide from our members. And so you'll see here the number of positions that are vacant. You'll see the vacancy rates that correspond to that. And then you'll also see the number of separations. And the way that the survey is structured, we're currently collecting the 2022 data since we do a retrospective survey at the beginning of every new year. So this information is reflective of 2021, which is the last full complete year of data that we have. And so you'll see that obviously these are higher numbers, right? When we have there on LPN vacancies on the urban area, so that second chart there, the employee vacancy right there in the middle of the screen is 33%. That's a very significant number. That's a third of employees that are vacant. Same for RN, same for CNAs. Those are very high numbers. And obviously turnover rates are significant as well. And even looking on the rural side there, when you compare it to the urban vacancies, they are a little lower in terms of the percentages. However, those are still high numbers in a traditional year. So, I mean, really, while that's unfortunately the standard now in these, post-COVID years, we really want to be able to get to a point where we can better staff all of our facilities throughout the healthcare system and lower those turnover rates. And so with kind of this background in mind, really have looked at this idea of healthcare apprenticeships. And so just kind of some background on how we at KHA got this on our radar was the governor appointed a new office of apprenticeship or registered apprenticeship this past year. Shonda Atwater is the lead of that office, and she has done an outstanding job of talking to groups like ours and throughout other industries and really kind of breaking down this barrier of apprenticeship. Because, when I first get the idea of apprenticeship, or when this was me at this time several months ago, like I'm sure many of you might hear as well, when you hear the word apprenticeship, you might think plumbers. You might think electricians, right? There's these other kind of skilled trades that's apprenticeship, right? But really, when Shonda talked to us and she brought to our workforce committee a gentleman from Colorado who works with a large health system there, and he is with a community college, and they work in tandem with this health system to do medical assistant apprenticeships. So this was one example of, okay, here's kind of this case study, if you will, of a real life example of someone doing healthcare apprenticeships. And so that really kind of sparked our interest. It was fueled by our members' interest of our workforce committee that saw this information back in August. And from that point, really, these last several months have been spent with doing a lot of this research on, okay, Kansas is really, we are not doing this at all. So there really are not places that are doing registered healthcare apprenticeships in Kansas. Of course, when you look at these 5 bullets about what is apprenticeship, all of this really fits into how we train our healthcare providers and our nurses and all of these trades in the first place. When you really break it down with these areas of on-the-job training, of course, you have your related technical instruction. That's your classwork. That's your education if you're getting a degree or other credential. Of course, you go back to number 1 on the job training to apply those skills that you learn, because you can't just read it out of a book and expect to apply it. That's the whole point of clinicals in healthcare, right? That's this is something that it's just part of how we train our healthcare professionals. And of course, mentorship, rewards for skill gains, and that essentially means the apprenticeship will start at a lower wage, and by the end of their apprenticeship program, when they've learned more, they're more highly skilled. It makes sense that they would be making a higher wage. And then a national credential, which that's anything from your CNA license, your LPN. Really, it's that credential point that really most roles in healthcare have. So we have done a lot of research from other states and looked at, okay, what are states doing? How is it working? And certainly some places they're doing these more entry-level roles of CNAs, surgical techs, patient care techs, medical assistants. So there are a lot of those roles. But we have found multiple states that are doing nursing apprenticeships, and many of them are specifically focusing on LPN apprenticeships. And so kind of just breaking it out into words just to make sure we understand. And I might then pause for questions to make sure we kind of all conceptually understand kind of how it works in a nutshell. So apprenticeship programs, and this is from actually, this source was part of your packet. So if you have not had the chance to review this, I encourage you to maybe skim through it while I touch on a few of these areas, or certainly after today's meeting. It was from 2019, the Missouri State Board of Nursing, and it was really them pitching the case from the nursing perspective of them saying healthcare apprenticeships would be a great way as standards are evolving to involve more competency-based instruction, that, hey, maybe healthcare apprenticeships could be an effective way of meeting workforce needs while still not losing quality through that. And so they address a lot of great points in that document. So I encourage you to reference that. So some highlights pulled out of that, since it is a few pages long. Apprenticeship programs meet all industry standards for training employees in regards to safety, education, and licensing requirements. So again, you might think of healthcare apprenticeship and say, okay, are we just, is a hospital taking a person and just trying to train them themselves without, standards? Is it to this hospital standards? No, we're not doing any of that at all. It is still very structured in terms of all of the same types of, or I guess many of the same types of educational requirements, and certainly the licensing requirements. None of that changes on the licensing side. For many occupations, the standard includes formal education in the form of a certificate or degree. And so for our conversation today, we're really focusing, since you are with the Board of Nursing, let's focus and limit this on really LPN apprenticeships. And so this standard is the practical nursing standards, and that credential is what you as a LPN apprentice would be making your way towards if you are in a LPN apprenticeship program. Apprenticeships work best with flexible distance education programs that accommodate the needs of healthcare providers. Many campuses already have programs that fit this model with little or no modification. So that's really to say, healthcare apprenticeships, they're great for both urban and rural. It's also maybe even more of an incentive for rural areas. So you don't have to ship, quote unquote, ship away your students or ship away staff to maybe upskill them if maybe they have to travel an hour or more away to go and try and get their education, because that's really where we see a lot of loss in rural areas of having to send away students to get education. They might not come back and return home to their rural communities. So as more and more community colleges, tech schools, and four-year universities are offering online modules of education, that really fits well with healthcare apprenticeship of, if you're able to do some of your education through online, whether it's, meeting online on something like Zoom, or maybe it's asynchronous, whatever the method is, as many of the schools in Kansas are moving towards these modules, that was again accelerated by COVID, that fits well with apprenticeship of both. If you're in a rural area, it still works. If you're in an urban area, that still works. It again really gives that flexibility. And then apprenticeships allow students to earn while they learn, enables staff and students to put their healthcare education into practice real time. So maybe instead of, waiting a semester and then doing a clinical or, whatever the structure might be, this is really looking at, if you're in a work week here, maybe 20 hours of it is that education of you going to classes. The other 20 is actual work that you are doing in the hospital. So you can really apply these skills while you are learning them in the classroom. And then obviously it provides income to students from a job that is tied directly to their career goals. So currently, I'm a fairly recent graduate of my undergraduate program, and obviously knowing many nursing students, and of course there's some throughout all programs, regardless of it's a healthcare degree or not. A lot of students have to work while they are obtaining their education because it's most people, they don't have scholarships to completely cover everything. So lots of folks have part-time jobs. Well, through healthcare apprenticeship, you are allowing students, or again, students might be restrictive of the term, whether this might be current staff in a facility, whether it's students going into programs. Again, there's lots of flexibility here, but really what this is saying is it allows students that are going through a program to maybe have a job that is actually related to the degree that they're pursuing. And again, an LPN apprentice, that would really be their job title while they are learning through the educational element of their LPN coursework. And so if you can have a job that is directly relevant to your program, I think it obviously makes sense that that's attractive to both students, but also maybe that provides even better training for that student so that, again, they're applying their skills from the classroom in real time. So effective LPN apprenticeships provide skills and bedside experiences, address skills, competency, and socialization to professional nursing. So again, if you're able to work amongst other nurses while you are getting your degree, while you are in this apprenticeship program, you're working while you're learning, you're able to have that socialization with nurses. This is one of the biggest roles, not just in healthcare, but throughout all industries, that there is such heavy socialization of new nurses coming into the workforce and getting those experiences. Number 3 there, enhanced ability to clinical reason much earlier in the educational conduit. And again, that's just because they're again applying their skills right from the get-go, essentially. Number 4, career advancement opportunities. So really, healthcare apprenticeships can be advertised or marketed essentially as a career advancement program. So if you have a hospital or a long-term care facility, whatever healthcare institution, if they, let's say they have a LPN apprenticeship program that they set up, this is a great way of maybe if you have current staff that are CNAs on their long-term care side or in whatever capacity, this is a great upskilling opportunity. So you're able to train them while keeping them employed in your facility, but you're able to get them that LPN if maybe they are ready to take that next step and continue along their nursing pathway. And lastly here, improve retention rates and significantly strengthens the nursing workforce. And apprenticeships have shown to have up to 92% retention rate. So when we were looking at, these really heavy vacancy and turnover numbers, the best way to avoid vacancies is addressing turnover. And apprenticeship has been shown nationally to have really, it's been key drivers in driving down retention percentages. So some background on what this looks like nationally, because again, as Karen and I have mentioned, this is happening throughout other states. Other states have already gotten on the bandwagon, if you will, of apprenticeship. And so over 26 states have healthcare apprenticeships already in place. Several states, including just two I'm going to highlight here of North Dakota and Texas, have very robust nursing apprenticeship programs that Kansas can maybe look at for some inspiration into how, if we want to consider this, if the Board of Nursing thinks that maybe this could be a potential, workforce idea, these are a few places that we have found through some research that really maybe have figured some of these pieces out for us, thankfully. And so looking at North Dakota specifically, their Board of Nursing passed what they have called an innovation educational model that allowed one of the colleges there in North Dakota, which is essentially kind of help kickstart apprenticeship in their state, to do LPN apprenticeship. So that really cleared the way to allow for, in terms of the regulatory side, it provided that pathway to allow for LPN apprenticeships to happen, if you will. And so there are other states that have done this. Some are more recent. I think North Dakota is probably one of the ones that have done this for at least a few years and have figured out some of these nuts and bolts. And so they have been a great resource. And you'll also see in your packet, one of the handouts is the LPN template, if you will, and that I will have on a few slides to review and kind of blow up here on the big screen. But that kind of gives you an idea of, okay, how does LPN apprenticeships, how are those structured? So that is the example from North Dakota that I encourage you to take a look at. That might help fit some of the pieces together a little bit more. But continuing on here. So who can be an LPN apprenticeship? So really, it's anybody that could be a student in an LPN program right now. But really what we are looking at is apprenticeship is a great way for employers to upskill their workforce, as we mentioned. And so this could be, again, as I said, staff that are already CNAs or other staff that you are wanting to maybe, let's say housekeeper. Maybe you might have a housekeeper on in your healthcare facility, but they might say, I would really like to go, on the patient care route. How can I start doing that? Well, really, this gives healthcare employers the ability to grow your own in a very structured format. And so you might say, okay, that healthcare institution, you say, okay, this housekeeper, we are going to put you in our CNA apprenticeship or our patient care tech apprenticeship, insert whatever, role there as kind of the foundational transition from housekeeping to let's start training you on patient care on the clinical side. So you get them enrolled in that apprenticeship, they obtain their CNA or whatever credential. And then that person says, okay, I've worked as a CNA now for, a couple of years. I would really like to be able to, again, take the next level and get my LPN. And if that healthcare institution has an LPN apprenticeship, again, this allows that person to remain employed in their facility while getting their education, while being upskilled and growing themselves as an employee. So really, it's a healthcare tool to continue building that pipeline. But again, making sure that we can do this, especially for places that can't afford to lose a lot of their employees right now, to send them out to obtain education, or really for employees that don't want to take, a year or even more off of working to try to go back to school and get that degree. So really, again, it gives this structured opportunity for both current staff, but certainly for maybe healthcare institutions that want to pull in others that might be working in retail from their community that say, hey, I really want to pursue a career in healthcare. This provides that structured advancement opportunity. And so here, as I mentioned, this is in your handouts. And this is the LPN in North Dakota, their apprenticeship model with Lake Region State College. So as you can see here, they're right here on RTI, and I know some of the text is small, so if you want to expand it on your own screens, I encourage you to do so. But just kind of talking through this briefly at a high level, you'll see kind of the time frames here of the process. The program details of the student enrolling in the LPN program. The student is then, participating in worksite education. In North Dakota, they register these apprentices on the North Dakota Board of Nursing Unlicensed Assistive Personnel Registry to allow for, the RN to delegate to that unlicensed person, the various tasks that are approved under the North Dakota Board of Nursing Standards. So you can read through some of those points there with the program details. Coming below here on this row, you'll notice these are courses. These are, again, relevant to Lake Region State College. But again, this LPN apprenticeship, they are still getting education. And it's flexible to allow for whether it's from a community college or from a learning management system, whoever, as long as it's approved in Kansas and by the board, that can be an avenue for the hospital, for that long-term care facility, for that clinic to educate their staff in this way. Then you'll see here expected on the job hours, OJTs on the job. You can see then the role in the facility. So obviously, CNAs or MAs, as it says down here, is what that person technically is until they get their LPN apprenticeship completed. And you'll see their credential earned throughout the process. So again, we'll pause at the end for questions if anyone wants to come back to this, but hopefully, again, it kind of lays out, well, what is the structure? We're talking a lot of it in abstract ways. Here's an actual example of what it looks like in practice. So kind of swinging here towards the end, again, I listed this example of North Dakota just again at a high level of the apprentice is a W-2 employee on day one. So this is not an internship. This is not a clinical experience. However, that apprentice, if they're working at this facility, they can do their clinicals there or at another location and be paid for that potentially. But again, the apprentice is really an employee of whatever institution and they're getting their education. So they are a W-2 employee making income while getting an education. The employer pays for that education. So in registered apprenticeship, the employers or the sponsors do pay for all of that educational cost. So again, it really builds us loyalty between the employee, which is the apprentice, and the sponsor, which is the employer. The LPN apprentice might work 20 hours a week, in actual, work duties, and the other 20 hours might be attending classes virtually or on campus and doing that work. And throughout the process, the apprentice learns from instruction and mentorship of, perhaps an already experienced LPN, or maybe an RN if they have a goal of maybe wanting to become an RN later in their life. And they fulfill an increasing number of competencies as part of their framework. And the apprentice program ends after 2,000 hours are met, and that is a federal Department of Labor requirement. And the apprentice has obtained their credential and earns a wage increase. So the benefits to the apprentice, again, as we've covered, that person is able to have a job, a paying job, while they're also gaining a professional degree in healthcare. It learns experience on the job while also learning the material from instruction. You can remain in your local community instead of leaving to attend a program elsewhere. You become a valued part of the hospital, in our case is KHA, or insert whatever clinical or hospital or healthcare environment by having a mentor. And then lastly, the apprentice develops that loyalty to the employer due to the employer's investment in the apprentice. And conversely, the employer benefits. As we looked at the beginning here, those slides of some of the numbers of vacancies and turnover rates, this is a really attractive way for healthcare institutions to build that pipeline of workers, to maybe fill some of the vacancies they're experiencing now, improving employee morale through having maybe a better or more well-rounded staff to properly staff their environments. As I mentioned, apprentices have a very high retention rate, which is great for curbing the currently high turnover rates that we're experiencing. Of course, this can reduce the need for contract labor. It supports new hires through a mentoring program, improves productivity, and decreases error and accident rates. And you'll notice here, as we've kind of verbalized throughout the process, which is this is no surprise to any of you, but just, kind of the visualization of, you starting out maybe through a CNA, nurse assistant role, you can continue to advance yourself, which is really what we want to do and partner with, organizations like the Board of Nursing, as we're all working kind of holistically to really try and advance our healthcare workforce in Kansas. And then you'll just see again a timeline of a potential. This is from one intermediary, which essentially helps do the administration and development of apprenticeship programs to really help with that HR lift. And you'll just notice the timeline. There was a lot of prep that goes into it, but then it is a continuous program over time of doing reporting to, the Federal Department of Labor, to any other necessary state or federal institutions on, what competencies is the apprentice meeting at what point, are they on track? Are they, needing more time on, on certain aspects of their education, whatever. But all of that is covered through that process. And that just kind of gives you an idea of that timeline on this slide. So I know that was maybe a bit of a fire hose, and I know there was a lot of stuff being covered, but I'm happy to go back to other slides and really dive into any of these deeper areas if you have a desire. But would love to open it up for questions, Madam President or whoever. If there's discussion, if there's questions, we'd be happy to answer those at this time or at the appropriate time. And I guess let me start off by asking you a question. Does this make sense at all? I know it's a lot. It's just kind of this different idea. Does any of it make sense? Are there specific areas I'd be happy to walk through, deeper?
Jaron, I think my question, and not part of your presentation, but one of the documents that we have within our agenda for today is an article written by the Missouri Board of Nursing, and it references that there is really no change or work from the Board of Nursing to support these, and that we have seen, in fact, I know of at least 2 in the state of Kansas of hospitals working with educational facilities to develop collaborative practice agreements. So
Sure.
What is your ask of us as a board, and what do you see our role in this being?
Well, and that's a great question, and thank you for the question. Really looking at this, and again, I don't know if there are significant differences between Missouri and Kansas or North Dakota and Kansas, for example, that would necessitate any changes needing to happen. I think, really the main thing is the support from the Board of Nursing to ensure that in terms of the regulatory side that, this really can have the go-ahead to move forward should the Board of Nursing have an interest in pursuing this. As we've had conversations with a lot of stakeholders, since it is such a new concept, we're all, figuring this out as we're kind of moving towards the line here. And so recently, I know the Board of Regents have approved all of their institutions to be able to both essentially bill this and account for student apprentices as part of on the education side. And so really, I think the main question, I'll go back a few slides, would be in Kansas to, if there was anything like this innovative educational model that would be necessary by the board's perspective to pass or authorize, if you will, to ensure to really give that green light. I think that's what we want to make sure that we have kind of those pieces aligned. Just to make sure really that if we want to pursue this, if this is of interest to you, as we and our members have found really interest in this as a potential workforce solution, wanting to make sure that we have that green light to go ahead on the regulatory side.
Yeah, and if I could just add, and Jaron, thank you, and Juliana, thank you for the question. I think that kind of would be an overall question. Is this an approach that the Board of Nursing would support? Do you all see potential in this? And as Jaron mentioned, would there be changes that would be necessary from a regulatory standpoint? And is there an opportunity for us to work together on this?
So I think my fear with the North Dakota model and the fact that they have the application process and the tracking of the apprentice programs, that's almost a more restrictive model. And, I'm anxious to hear from the other board members, but just by the act of requiring an application and going through accounting for individuals in an apprentice program, that feels a lot more restrictive and cumbersome, more heavy from a regulatory hand. Whereas I'm speaking on behalf of my own understanding and my own belief. So we may have an opportunity to talk about, is there a lightening of some verbiage or something along those lines? But I wouldn't want to require extra steps when a educational institution, along with a hospital, may be able to develop collaborative agreements and achieve what you're looking for by, as opposed to adding an extra regulatory requirement.
Sure.
So, I guess, Jaron, I think maybe what I heard from you is you may be asking for a word of support from the board for an apprentice type program. And that may be something we could take to our next board meeting and see if that is, if the board would want to endorse that or offer some type of statement along those lines. Becky has her hand raised and I do really want to hear from her. I just am worried about trying to add in another regulatory checkbox list. Sure. That's going to add time. It's going to take our staff a while to compile this list of students, when really what are we trying to achieve would be my question. So I'll stop. Becky, I apologize. Go for it.
Oh, no problem, Julianne. I agreed with everything you said, because that was what I was reading and thinking too about our side and our responsibilities. But what is the response of the hospitals in the state of Kansas, especially rural? I live out here in Hayes. Mm-hmm. And finances is always such a big issue for hospitals taking over the critical access hospitals taking over something like this. This would be awesome for them, but Absolutely. The financial part. So how have the hospitals reacted to this?
Yes, great question. I'm very glad that you asked that. So so our workforce committee that initially had heard this idea, kind of some of our next steps, we had a subcommittee formed that was made up of actually a majority of rural hospitals. It did have a few larger ones from urban areas as well to kind of get a balance as we started doing some diving into this. And so we've kind of begun, as we're again starting from the very ground up, and in some of these areas until we kind of have the official go ahead when it comes to the LPN side of this, starting with things like CNAs or patient care techs or other roles. And we actually have several critical access hospitals who are some of our first pilots of this, if you will, which is really exciting. And so you hit the nail on the head. It can be a very significant human resource administrative lift, especially at many of our rural facilities that might have one person that does all of their HR stuff. And so the nice thing that we have in Kansas, well, and really across the nation, there are things called intermediaries that I referenced. And an intermediary, there are multiple companies, I believe, in Kansas that are approved. This information comes from Hamilton Riker, which is a national organization, but they've started to have some conversations with our hospitals. But the nice thing is they're already approved in Kansas and approved nationally. And so they have a lot of the competencies and the frameworks, if you will, that have been approved by the Federal Department of Labor. And so they are really able to help they really come in and guide, and I hesitate to use the word handhold, but they're really there to partner with the hospital, side by side, to make the lift and the burden on the hospital side as minimal as possible. And so really on the rural hospital or most hospitals, the main requirement, at least up front, is, sending over to the intermediary job descriptions to make sure that, whatever the job description and requirements that the hospital wants for, their LPNs or CNAs. So maybe one hospital wants to, would like maybe some of their CNAs to be trained in, one specific, item more than another. There's a flexibility there. So it's getting that into alignment. But beyond that, in terms of approvals, by the federal and state governments, and all of those types of things. That's managed by intermediaries like Hamilton Riker. And so the answer to your question is that really the burden becomes little to none on the rural hospitals, because they just really have to say, okay, we have these people, we can recruit people, or we have staff that we want to put into this program. That's essentially all that they have to do. The intermediaries help take care of the rest and put those other pieces together.
And just one other thing, if I could add, and I see another question there too, to Jaren's comment, Rebecca, and thank you for raising it. We also have two things. One, cost is a real concern, but we also know that our hospitals, many of them, have had really significant increases in labor costs over the last several years, especially when looking at travel nurse and travel staff costs. And so they're looking for innovative ways to recruit and retain talent, in their own communities and within their hospitals. That's kind of one aspect. And we've also seen some hospitals who've kind of done this organically. And Anna mentioned, hospitals she's aware of that are partnering with nursing educational programs in their area. I've also heard from several critical access hospitals who maybe are informally working with high school to get high schoolers, working and shadowing in the hospital sooner, and then maybe setting up their own internal career ladder, starting with a patient care tech position and then supporting students with scholarships to, an LPN program. So I just wanted to mention that as well. And I know Audrey has a question. I did want to mention, we have just a couple of minutes left because Jaren and I, we left our advocacy day and we've got to head back to that for the KHA board meeting. But maybe if we could,
I might.
One more
and I'm going to say,
question.
Karen, and if you need to step off, I can stay for maybe a few more minutes,
Okay.
since I don't think I have to be the right first thing. So if we
Okay.
do extend over, I'm happy to stay for a
Okay.
little bit longer.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, no worries. I know Audrey's got a question there, and I just want to thank you again for the opportunity because I'll be dropping off in a little bit, but we can continue our conversation with you all and Carol as well.
My question was, what do you mean by veteran application? That's in week
Sure.
2, the green.
Yeah. So great question. And this was just the template from Hamilton Riker. And so this isn't specific towards LPN apprenticeship. The veteran, or I guess this graphic you have on the screen is in reference to, really all kinds of apprenticeship. This is the standard steps that you see through the process. Hamilton Riker and what we have looked at also with KHA is trying to do more with veterans and transition assistance programs. So that's on my agenda for this year, to do more with that and to get those more established and align some things here in Kansas with working more with veterans and those transitioning. But Hamilton Riker does have some programs in place as both apprenticeship, but also if hospitals want to get connected with trying to recruit veterans, or if there's if they're close to a military base, wanting to transition some of those workers into their organizations. Hamilton Riker, part of their organization, offers that kind of assistance. So it's not always going to be tied to this program of apprenticeship, but that's just there kind of as this process. If there is a veteran that wants to do apprenticeship, that's just a note in there as in terms of that's where that step would be.
Well, Jaren and Karen, I really appreciate your presentation. I think you have a lot of good information and obviously a topic that's near and dear to many of our hearts. I appreciate what you've shared with us. I think my takeaway is that we may add an agenda item to our next large board meeting to discuss maybe a statement of support, and seeing if we can't at least get you some verbal support in that way. I also don't want to hinder any of the work, and I appreciate what you're saying. So as we move through today's meeting, we may discuss other opportunities to help as well. So any other questions or comments for Jaren? I'm not sure if Karen had already jumped off or not.
There's also a concern from the educator side, and I see Janelle had a question from the educator side of this overall, there's a shortage of faculty too, and it seems like reading this, this is going to require maybe some more, and that would be a concern on the education program side of this too. It's awesome. This is wonderful, but I want to look at the educator side of this too. And Janelle, did you want to pipe
Absolutely.
in?
Oh, I just had mentioned it as I'm a staff person. But yeah, working with the programs too, that, what is the lift for the programs in terms of all the work that it takes to collaborate with
Right.
how the apprenticeship program works. And then there's also the factor of the liability. Where's the liability between the nursing programs, the nurses who are working as mentors in the facilities and the facility themselves? I think those are big questions that come up when I have talked with those who are in nursing programs or anybody about this type of possibility.
And
Thank
those are
you.
great questions. If I may, is there a moment I can touch on those briefly? I don't want to keep extending it if we're out of time. So
Please go ahead, Jaron.
Okay. Well, so on the educator side, absolutely right. I mean, that is a huge component. They are, short-staffed just as healthcare institutions are.
Mhm.
And, Carol and I both on this work group that we are working with the Board of Regents, we are addressing some of those areas. And so hopefully, we are finalizing some of our recommendations in this upcoming month. And I think we'll hopefully have some positive news to hopefully we can kind of take out from that and maybe see some action by the legislature and others to help on that front, because you are absolutely right. That is a very dire need that we need to address. And that goes, what's good for the educators is good for the hospitals and other providers, because it's all of this circular pipeline, right? We need each other. And so that has been a key focus. And thankfully, if some programs, if they don't have, full capacity of students at this point, certainly if they have staff or the students that they, would admit nonetheless, this shouldn't add too big of a burden, again, as we kind of, unleash this over the next year or two, as we, move forward and getting these off the ground. I don't think it's, realistic to expect 100 in the first year, you know what I mean? I don't think we'll see that kind of, trajectory. So I do think that since we are kind of, as more and more folks start to pilot it and then really get it off the ground, and as it spreads, I think that should help the adjustment to everyone. But really on the colleges side as well, I'll just lastly mention since there is coursework already going into place, there really isn't too much that adds on in terms of colleges have to restructuring programs or any of that kind of thing. That we have not seen those issues as we've looked at places nationally and programs that we have talked to about this concept of apprenticeship. And on the liability side, we haven't seen those issues in other states as well. That when it comes to whether you have a student coming in through a clinical or whether it's since these people are employed by the hospital, we haven't seen issues of apprenticeship causing this liability issue. But I certainly understand that was one concern that came to our mind first and foremost that we looked into and talked to folks about. So but just wanted to comment on those few items if that helps.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you very much, Jaron.
You bet. Thank you all for having us. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll move on down a little bit and continue our discussion. A lot of this is similar topics. Carol, would you like to make any comments about the data that you provided? I think you have a competency checklist in here and some other items that you've provided for our review.
Yeah, this is Carol Moreland. And actually the competency checklist, I think that you're talking about, that starts on page 20. I think that was actually part of Jaron's handout too. And, I think it's very good to show just how much detail this is going to have to be. I put the nursing apprenticeship, I put some other information in there. And I just want to bring your caution, when you say nursing apprenticeship, I think there's a lot of different methods out there and a lot of people have a different idea. So, and I think Jaren probably agrees with this. It's going to have to be determined very, very closely as to what that's going to look like. So I just provided some information from maybe some of the other boards of nursing and how they've done it. I'm not saying I'm advocating one way or the other. There's Idaho, there's Alabama, and then there's some information in there from Texas. So I just put that information in there for a reason. And I have to get off just momentarily. I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry, I know it seems like it just is it's a busy day. There's a lot going on. I'm responding to Adri. I think she's having to jump and do some things as well. So anyway, I appreciate what Carol presented and there's a lot of information. I would like to call at page 37 of the packet that was presented, there's an article. Again, this is the one I referenced earlier in my comments to Jaren from the Missouri State Board of Nursing. And on page 2 of the article, which appears on page 37 of our task force, it says that implementation of academic clinical partnerships does not require special approval by the Missouri State Board of Nursing. And so I am personally of the opinion that applies in Kansas, and I'll just kind of open that up. Janelle, I don't know, is there some language that maybe I've overlooked that would require something for approval from us in our Nurse Practice Act, or is there any comments there?
No, and Carol and I talked about this just a little bit, and I won't say this is exactly what she said. We may want to ask her too, but how we've kind of approached this in the past, and Carol's back, is that no, if we didn't have any regulatory change, it would just have to make sure that any partnership that was forged would have to follow the regulatory requirements that we already have. And a couple places where that might impact are in the clinical resources section, because we currently have a 20% cap on preceptorship. I don't know if this would be included as a mentoring thing, whether that would be considered preceptoring or how that would be looked at. So that could be one cautionary place, or that's something that might have to be changed if it were to allow for that. Or if they're going to call it mentoring and it truly is not preceptored clinical time, then, that has to be clearly outlined in any kind of contract or between the facility and the nursing program. So those are the kind of things that if it's going to be outlined for programs according to regulation, that's where some of that work may come in, is how is that going to be handled to look at so that there is no regulatory. Missouri didn't make any changes in their regulations for that to allow them to do that, but that means they're having to work within the regulations that are set the way they are. They didn't have to make any changes, but that would have to be looked at for Kansas, I believe, for that statement to be made.
Thank you very much, Janelle. That's helpful. And I think I did make note of that 20% cap. So Carol, I'll just, I apologize. I think we were jumping all over the place. So were there other thoughts you wanted to make?
No, I think Janelle kind of hit it. I think you're going to have to decide whether this is going to be regulatory changes or not, because, like Janelle said, we do have some things, and, Jaren is still on here. So if I could ask him a question on this one chart, it's the one that you have, it's got a lot of blue and it's kind of a chart thing, and it's got from Lake Region State College, and it has like the expected on the job hours. It has like 144 hours of clinical and then like 320 hours of on the job. So 564 hours this semester. So I just want to see if I understand this. So the 144 hours would be all that's counted as clinical, and that would be with a faculty member there. But then this 320 hours would truly be working as an employee. It would not count toward their clinical time. And the reason I ask this question is we have in our regulations in clinical learning that they have to be supervised and evaluated by a faculty. And that's why I'm trying to figure out just how much faculty involvement there is in this 564 hours. I don't know, does that make sense to anybody?
Yes.
Okay.
It's
Great
page
question.
12 of the
Thank
packet.
you. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thank you for the question. So the 144 hours, you can see kind of every semester of that clinical experience, that would be no different than, I mean, if we want to make it different, we can, but really as we are looking at this, it would not be any different or need to be any different than as a current LPN student doing your clinicals. There should not be a reason for that to be different than how it currently operates. I will just mention, and I don't think that there is anything in regulation that would prohibit this, but a lot of states actually do pay those LPN apprentices for their clinical hours. And so for example, if the apprentice is maybe doing some clinicals at the facility they're employed, if that employer wanted to, they could pay that student, that apprentice, for that time. They do not have to technically, but I will, emphasize that, because especially as lots of folks have looked at this as, wanting to obviously pay more students to have that, those opportunities. So anyways, and yes, the on-the-job training is just the work hours. So that's the time that as an employee, you are working and doing other things. Sure, you're applying some of your knowledge that you're starting to learn, but we look at that as differently than the clinical experience that is part of your LPN curriculum. If that makes sense, does that help? Okay, or go ahead, ask a follow-up.
It sounds like as long as it's clearly spelled out in the agreement between the hospital and the institution that our definition that's already in the statute of supervised clinical practice is clearly defined so that they know how to differentiate what counts clinical and what's not. And if we keep those hours according to our statute, then we wouldn't have to redo stuff. Is that kind of what it sounds like? It's flexible and wiggle enough that it's between the facility and the school?
If that's directed towards me,
Yeah.
okay, just making sure I don't want to step on any toes. Again, thank you for the question. That's the thing with registered apprenticeship. There's obviously some requirements, but really at the end of the day, it is very flexible on a per organization basis. So I would be in agreement to that of really it's the contract between the hospital or whatever institution and their educational institution, that relationship and those, that's something between them. But that's how I understand it, as you just mentioned it as well. We're under the same page.
To keep it in the statutes of the state of Kansas then, right, okay.
Okay, this is Carol. I think Juliana had to step off for just a moment, so she asked me, is there any more questions or anything from anybody on this? Or feel like you have a pretty good idea what you're interested in and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Jaron, very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you all. And I see Michaela, if you have something, if you need to email it to me.
Oh,
See,
just
Michaela, go ahead.
real quick question, just quantitative data to show that these programs actually work. I saw the 92% retention rate. I would love to see a drill down on the actual programs in North Dakota and Texas. Maybe.
Sure, we can get that. Texas, they, I believe, are still fairly fluid with in terms of, I don't know that because really they really kickstarted theirs at the first half of 2022. So since the apprenticeship is usually at least a year, I don't know that they have in terms of numbers of, completed and those numbers. I will see what we can pull from North Dakota since they should have at least a few years of data potentially. So I'll be happy to grab that and at the earliest convenience, shoot that over to Carol or whoever to get that disseminated. So certainly can do that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, is there any other questions for Jaron or anything before we move on? I don't see any other hands up.
Nope.
All right, thank you. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
I put in your packet just some other things that have come to us that people have maybe asked that the board kind of think about. Okay, and so it has to do with education regulations and stuff like that. So I kind of talked to Juliana and we thought this might be a good place to kind of start some of this discussion. So on page 83, you know, how we do their pass rates right now is we look at 80%. They need to be 80% or above of their first time test takers for a calendar year. Well, some of the nursing programs have really felt that maybe that is a little restrictive in the fact that sometimes some of the students will take the NCLEX the first time, not really, how do I say this, not really caring whether they passed or not. They just want to see what it's like. And so they don't pass it the first time, then they get engaged, they come back the second time and they pass it. Okay, well, that doesn't help their pass rate the way it is right now, because we only look at first time takers. So the nursing program has kind of said, you know, ASIN and CCNE has a different way of doing it. They like have 3 different ways that it can be figured. So when I talked to Juliana, she suggested maybe that I put in here 60-2-102, which is the regulation that has the NCLEX pass rate information in there. So what you see in yellow on here, highlighted in yellow, would be changes that could be made to this if you wanted to follow ASIN or CCNE. It's kind of up to you what you want to do, but that gives the program a little bit more flexibility because they can count, you know, those second timers and stuff like that if they wanted to. So it would give them some flexibility. And then what I did on page 90, what all the member boards do is we submit information to National Council on a yearly average or yearly date. And we have to answer questions about a lot of different things, but you have in here what was in 2021, how the other boards do their pass rates, you know, what standard do they require? And if their standard is a percentage of the national pass rate, what percentage do you require and stuff? I just put that in there so you could kind of see what the other states do. And that's just totally up to you, but I thought that information might be helpful. So I don't know. I'm sorry, on page 88 is where you have the criteria from ASIN and CCNE. So you can see, I just pulled that out of their standards manual.
So Kara, would we need to bring this up at the education meeting, these proposed changes for discussion there too?
Typically when you do revisions to the regulations, they do start in a committee and then the committee approves them out and they go to the board. And then if it's approved at the board level, then that's where I thought I started through the state approval process.
That was my next $1 million question. I know how long it took to get these passed and implemented. Can you even give us some idea or projection how long it would take for these little changes to get done?
No, I really wish I could do a timeline. I think what you have to understand right now is the Department of Administration and the Attorney General's office, I'm sure, are just like swamped right now because of the legislative session. Because they have to review a lot of stuff that goes over there. And I heard in a committee meeting the other day, there's on the average about 350 or 400 bills they want to introduce this session.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, so I will just say this will probably not be the top priority. Not to say that they won't get to it when they can, but that will slow the process down. It's just the timing until probably April, May. And then you have to understand anything that's passed, as you remember, passed in the session and has to be implemented by July 1st, which some of it does, if you have to make any changes to your regulations, those take priority too. And that's what we ran into with the APRN. So feasibly, you know, these might not make it to the top of their list until after, you know, July sometime. I can't say that for sure,
No,
but
I know.
I just want to make you aware of that.
Yeah.
So in saying all of that, though, I will remind this group that the reason we're all meeting is that there was a legislative charge to us to look at easing the regulations required for licensure. And I do think that this is one example of us being able to do that. And so I think it's important that we really take that charge and take some responsibility as the Board of Nursing, as opposed to letting non-nurses maybe make those decisions for us. And so I think this is a good step. And I'd like to hear from the board members, if we as a task force would like to recommend to the Education Committee to consider this as our proposal, and then maybe at least through our own group, we could get some pretty quick action and turnaround in response to the request that we've been charged with. So Michaela, Andrea, Becky, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I agree with
Absolutely.
you, Juliana. Especially this would also tell the people that brought this forward that we listened and hearing and we're acting. And that includes our own nursing programs that asked to look at this. Right.
That's true. That's a great point, Becky. I had forgotten that part of it, but that's a great point.
Yeah. I agree. I think we should.
Yeah, and I'm pretty, in my brain, I think that's why I asked for the quantitative data, because we can kind of say all day long, hey, this works, but if we can prove it with some real numbers and present that to legislature, that would be great.
Yes, that's a good point.
So, sorry, just for clarification. So are you asking this in terms of suggesting that we change the pass rate requirement? Is that your question?
It's changing the language, Andrea, to be consistent with what ASIN and other certifying bodies of nursing schools are already responding to. So we have recently made changes to our pass rate requirements. That's probably, I think that my COVID timeline messes up all the time, but I'm going to say that was in the last 2 to 3 years we made that change. Right after we changed ours, then the certifying bodies made a change to their language. So this then would be keeping us consistent and up to date with ASIN and those certifying bodies that the nursing colleges are already having to respond to. So in essence, they don't have two regulations and two ways of calculating a pass rate that they have options, actually, is what this gives them, is some options to calculate their pass rate, as opposed to just having a very narrow definition.
But we left it at 80%, Andrea, right, Juliana? It's still going to be 80%. It's how many attempts you have to justify that 80% to the board.
That's correct. That's correct. It's based on first-time test takers, or on first-time test takers and repeat test takers, or on a national means of the nursing program. So it gives them kind of 3 opportunities to take the number of students that have passed, whether that's first-time test takers or first-time and repeat test takers, to hit that 80%. We are still maintaining the 80%,
right.
but allowing them that flexibility recognizes, that their success and failure isn't necessarily based on 1 year. and 1 year alone, that they have an opportunity to, for whatever reason, COVID, great example, a particular year may not have been quite as successful. That doesn't necessarily mean the program's bad. There could have been extenuating circumstances, and this allows them to account for those. And the national certifying agencies are recognizing this as well. So this isn't something unique to Kansas. This is what other national agencies have set forth.
Yeah, and I guess so I understand that, and I am supportive of that. I think education committee, or, certainly for discussion of the board, I guess I'm just having a hard time connecting the dots for how that change or recommendation will address the concern of the number of nurses available to practice in Kansas. I don't know how that update or change responds to the question at hand, I guess.
So Andrea, in my view, what that does is allows nursing programs to have more options to stay in good standing. So then they are not having to respond to questionable whether they are complying with regulation. And so then having to, eventually it potentially could lead to closure of some nursing programs or more restriction in nursing programs. So that keeps more nursing seats open and allows for more nursing students to be in educational programs. I don't know if anyone else would like to offer anything. So I see what you're saying, Andrea, but I do think it is a loosening of regulation.
Because when the program's saying they're on probation, that might scare away, applicants, or, they might have this rumor going around, about their program because they're on probation by the board, which is, again, not necessarily always a reflection of their quality of their program.
Does that help, Andrea?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it does.
I think you have a very valid point. I don't think there is a direct correlation by changing this, then all of a sudden we're going to have 10 more nurses. And so I do think you have a very valid point there.
If I may, Madam President, I think one of the things that I've seen in terms of allowing that is programs are struggling to, I think Juliana was correct initially too about, staying in good standing, and Becky too, staying in good standing and how we look at that. And that if one program has a year, because we rely very heavily on that first time pass rate in our evaluation of the program. And the way that we do it is very restrictive. And what CCNE and ASIN have been able to show or to look at is some different ways to look at how they might meet that standard, just like we would anything else. As long as they're meeting it, it allows a program one bad year. And because of what we require now, our regulations changed last year. So in 2022, that changed. So for 2023, anybody who doesn't meet that 80% standard is going to have to write a report. They're going to have to follow up with it. There's a lot that the program has to do and that takes away from their other resources that gets nurses through their program, if that makes any sense. It kind of is the long-term effect down the road for them, as much as maybe not the initial, it's not going to put 10 more nurses on there right now, but it might keep their time and efforts focused on getting their students to the level that they need to be without having to drop out 1 year and really focus on something that may or may not be helpful. It may have just been a 1 year anomaly. So I think that it addresses it that way. And I know that's not a direct correlation, but I do think from the education side, it's a really important point in terms of some changes in licensure requirements that might be helpful, or regulatory requirements that might be helpful in the long run. I don't know if that helped clarify anything.
So maybe I'll just ask, is there any opposition to that change? And if not, then we would see this as maybe a recommendation coming out of this task force to be presented to the education committee and allow them to review that and then potentially send on for further review by the board. But I'll ask if there's any opposition. Okay, so maybe Carol, if we can just one of the takeaways from this task force be that action.
Okay.
And then I know that Carol did present for us ratios, and I apologize. My dad's having some health concerns. I had to step away for just a minute and take a phone call from the doctor. But did you have any discussion about the
No.
ratios? Yeah. Okay.
You haven't
So
yet.
one of the things we talked about was that in our Nurse Practice Act, the clinical ratios, so number of students to one instructor, is outlined. For us, it's a 1-to-10 ratio. We've talked about whether that can be lightened or not. There's been several conversations about the fact that, it's typically not, we don't see a lot of schools going over that 1-to-10 ratio simply because then it dilutes the support for the students. So I personally made the comment that I didn't feel as tied to that standard, just simply because we don't see as many people, exceeding that or even doing the 1-to-10. It's usually a much lower ratio. I don't feel as prescriptive there because I do think the pass rates are of such importance and that there's other regulations that are more guiding to ensure good education than having a requirement for ratios. So I wouldn't have a problem personally with increasing that ratio. However, with that being said, I don't know that a lot of the clinical sites would truly do that. One, because most of the clinical sites themselves don't have the capacity to take on additional students, and two, most of the colleges are not even coming close to meeting that 1-to-10. They're more 1-to-8 or 1-to-5 to 6 is what I've been hearing a lot of, and others I'm sure have other experiences that they might be able to add on to. But that's why you see this information. Now, what Carol did present for us from NCSBN is that it appears that majority of states have the current regulation that we do, and that 1-to-10, both for PN as well as for, in the RN program, the majority is actually at a 1-to-8 ratio as opposed to the 1-to-10. So we already are kind of right there with the norm. But I did want to hear from the group to see if there's any desire to change that 1-to-10 ratio in our regulation. Janelle, yeah, I see your hand in the air.
Just a quick addition before that response is just hearing from the school side. I will tell you that while you're concerned the way that you presented it, I wouldn't have that concern either. But I do know there are schools that struggle with their administration. If we make any changes or allow any more, they will be pushed to do that. And they will, I think clinical sites will limit that. But in places where it might not, the schools are going to struggle to really meet that. And I think safety wise, it's a concern if we would do that. So I'm just going to put those two things out there from a program side as part of the conversation.
Thank you, Janelle. That's helpful.
It's very helpful because that's how they justify why nursing programs are so expensive, and they use that statute. They have to use that statute to support their faculty ratios. So, amen. It's great. I'm glad we're about average as everybody else is, and the acuity in today's world it's so different than when that statute was written.
It's a great point, Becky. The acuity, I think that's something.
Oh, it's horribly worse than it. Remember, and when that statute was written, the people that were in ICU are on the floors today.
Yeah.
And that's why the 1 to 10 worked great for years. In my 5 years of nursing, it was wonderful. But as the acuity got higher and higher on the floors, it's unsafe. And of course, the clinicals don't allow it anymore anyway.
I see a lot of head nods with this discussion. So maybe the direction of this task force would be more that this is an option we considered, and based upon the data from NCSBN, as well as the discussion that we've had here, points that Janelle shared with us, as well as then Becky talking about, kind of the situation that might put some of our nursing programs in. And I am not aware of any nursing program asking for that to be that ratio to be increased. Carol, Janelle, are you aware of any programs asking for that?
This is Carol, and where this came up, I will tell you, is when I was over providing testimony, when I was told that the board needed to look at some of the education regulations. I got some questions about this from some of the committee members because they had heard that this was so restrictive and we needed to take it to 1 to 20, something along that line. Again, I think part of it is their understanding and feedback that's being given to the legislators. So that's why I put it in here. I don't think it's the nursing programs that suggested this, but since that was specifically asked to me, I wanted to make sure that I could say that I had taken it to board and shared that with them.
That makes sense, Carol. So we may discuss, our response to that committee, and we may need to put some things in writing. And, to Andrea's point, we may have to really give some whys about the changes or the lack of changes that we may be making. And I'm just reading faces and head nods. So if anyone else has anything to add, please feel free to jump in. But I hear that we may want to stick where we're at with the 10 to 1 ratio, as opposed to loosening that up any and really, expanding that number. And I think there's valid documentation here based upon NCSBN data to support that. Am I reading the group correctly? I see Andrea's head nodding, and I think Michaela.
I was going to say, with the apprentice program, thank you. Does that change anything? I mean, doesn't that make that better if they go through, if one type of program is the 1 to 10 ratio and another type of program is the apprentice, they actually do have a 1-to-1 setup. So if they felt like they wanted to be in a program that was 1-to-1 and more catered to them, couldn't they go through an apprentice program versus a traditional program? I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
Well, this is Carol, and that's why I was asking the questions about what's really considered clinical and what's considered on the job. Because again, if it's any clinical time, even though they're in this apprenticeship, they're going to have to follow our regulations. So it would still be 1 to 10. However, when they're doing this on the job, which is not clinical time, then they wouldn't be abiding by our regulations the way that I understand it. Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay.
So it's just going to have to be differentiated very well as what's clinical and what's not.
Okay, well, I think that is a lot of the information that we have gathered here that we wanted to discuss today with the committee. And so, Carol, I think maybe we need to put a very brief but maybe powerful document together that we could share back, particularly to Representative Lineweir and her committee, to share the outcomes so far from this task force. And, you know, I don't think we're necessarily done based upon the presentation earlier from Kansas Hospital Association and Jaren and Karen. I thank them for coming to present to us. I think we can discuss at our board meeting whether we would want to have a statement of support, and maybe between now and then we could, Janelle, I don't know if we could ask of you to maybe review the Nurse Practice Act in detail in that education section to see if there's some items that we could make some changes to that might be supportive of that apprentice relationship without adding a lot of regulatory mud to slow down any of that work.
So this is Carol. Can I just clarify? So are you wanting this topic put on the agenda for the March board meeting, or are you wanting it to start in the education committee in March? No.
I think that so this is my personal opinion. I think that the changes with respect to pass rates needs to start in the education committee. The other items, I think, potentially could go straight to the board. Janelle, I don't know what you might find as far as recommendations to the Nurse Practice Act. If they are significant, it might benefit us to have one more task force meeting to really look at those and then maybe give them direction to start in a committee prior to the board meeting in March.
So in the next week?
Yes. 2 weeks. I mean, I'm sure you've got a lot going on, but in the next couple of weeks, if you could look at that and if there's some changes that you feel like.
It's better now, as site visits will start up again pretty regularly once February hits.
Okay. And I don't, if we have to have another task force meeting, it may, I wouldn't foresee that it would be very lengthy. I think it may just be quickly to review anything that Janelle might find. And if Janelle doesn't find any big significant changes that need to come up, then we may just be able to have our committee meetings come March. Does that sound agreeable to the group?
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate everyone being on here. I know we're just a minute over, so thank you very much for your attendance. And we will consider our task force adjourned for today. And I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.